Morning, church. This morning we're going to continue our study in the book of Ruth. If you want to be opening your Bibles, we're looking today at chapter 2. I've entitled this little series of lessons out of Ruth, and then we'll look at Esther later on. When light shines in darkness. You know, we live in a time that in many ways culturally, societally is pretty dark. And it's a blessing when you see light shining in darkness, when you see godly people doing good things. And it's always been that way. There's always been darkness in this world. And certainly during the time of Ruth, it's a dark period. It's the period of the judges. And again, if you're familiar with the judges at all, you know how low Israel had sunk at that point in time. And yet, I think what God's wanting to tell you is that even in this time of great darkness in the history of Israel, there were some really good people doing some really good things. There was light shining in the darkness. And so I want to begin just to kind of bring you up to speed if you weren't able to be here for the last lesson. There's a Jewish family. They live near Bethlehem. There is a terrible drought in Judea. And so they decide to jump across the Jordan River to go east over into the land of Moab, where apparently there's still enough food for people to live on, and they move over there. A wife, a husband, and their two sons. While they're there, both sons marry, and life seems to be pretty good. And then about 10 years in, calamity strikes, and all three men die. Naomi, the mother-in-law, is left with two young women, widows, to care for. She tells them, hey, you know, you probably, because they're Moabite girls, you probably just need to stay in Moab. One of them chooses to do that. But Ruth says, no, Naomi, I want to go with you. And in that beautiful statement of commitment, remember, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so she travels back to the area around Bethlehem with Naomi. But it's a tough time. I mean, these women have nothing when they get back over into Judea. And that kind of sets us up now for chapter 2. And I want to begin by just reading chapter 2 so you'll have the text in your head as we then talk about it. Again, reading out of the English Standard Version. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please, let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink that the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And now you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you didn't know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, come here, and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine, and So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied. And when she had some left over, when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean. Don't rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all the harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now there's several different lessons, I think, that we could draw from this. Arbitrarily, I'm going to choose three that I want us to think about this morning. First of all, notice that God made provision for the poor. He didn't make provision for the lazy. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9, again in chapter 23, verse 22, and in Deuteronomy 24, verse 19, God made provision for the poor and for the alien in Israel. Reading from Leviticus 19:9, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest." In other words, what God is saying is, in a time when, again, there are no food stamps, folks. There's no social safety net. There's nothing to fall back on in that way at all. How are the poor going to be able to find food? He says, God says, during the time of harvest, leave the edges of the field, don't harvest them. And if grain falls out as you're gleaning, let it lay there and let folks come in and pick it up. But notice that the poor had to work for their grain. It's not something that was just handed to them. It's not like the Israelites were told, well, take 5% of your grain, put it in bags, and set it out for poor. It wasn't that way at all. They had to come out, they had to work for it, they had to glean it, they had to gather it. In 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10, Paul writing to the Thessalonian brethren says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." This idea that God makes provision for us is a beautiful one. But I think it's also important to note that when he makes provision, he expects people to work for that provision. A culture which simply hands things to people and doesn't require them to work, I think, incipiently, ultimately, sows a kind of sickness in that culture and in that society. It's very important as human beings that we work, that we be involved in doing things, that we earn our way. And God recognized that even for the poor. Okay? Yes, we'll take care of you, but you're going to have to go out and work for what you get. Now, I want you to think about some things that Ruth did not choose to do that she could have done here. Okay, because she chooses now to go out and work in this field. She didn't choose to beg. Go to a major city now and go to a street corner, and what are you going to find? Beggars. You know, when I go to Austin, I am just amazed. It seems like at every corner in this huge metropolis, there's somebody sitting there and they've got a sign and they've got a sack or they're waiting and they're begging. Beggar after beggar after beggar. You go to Tulsa now, and a whole lot of corners, what are you going to find? you're going to find people sitting there and they're begging. It's what they're doing. Ruth could have chosen to beg. It's not like there weren't a lot of beggars at that time, but that's not what she's chosen to do. She didn't choose to prostitute herself. Now, I know that sounds graphic and gross, but in that day and age, unfortunately, that was a choice that a lot of women made in order to support themselves and their families. She chose not to follow that path. She chose not to sell herself. She didn't choose to steal. A lot of people choose to steal in difficult times. I don't know if you heard the other day, there was a fellow, a part of a federation here in this state that represents those that own stores and businesses and things of that nature, retail association. And he was talking about how incredibly difficult it is increasingly for business owners to cope with the amount of theft that they have to deal with. That many of them are looking at having to raise their prices significantly because they're being stolen blind by people who come in. It is a horrible problem that's probably underreported. There are a lot of people who choose to steal in order to get what they think they need or want. Ruth doesn't take that path. What Ruth chooses to do is an honorable, though not easy way to provide for her and Naomi. She's going to get out in the heat and in the sun in what could be, did you hear the text, a very dangerous situation. I mean, sometimes these women are attacked in the fields like this. It's not necessarily a safe way to go about things, but she chooses to take this avenue. Solomon will write in Proverbs 28, verse 6, "Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a rich man who's crooked in his ways." Again, in Proverbs chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, "The Lord is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints." I think Ruth's experience here is living confirmation of this truth. She makes the choice to do the honorable thing. Not the easy thing, the honorable thing. She makes the choice to do what's right. And God blesses her and watches over her. I had a friend while I was living in Lubbock who was asked by his company to take some steps in business that he just felt like were unethical. He just had a real problem with it. He felt like morally they were kind of dodgy. And they pressured him, and he just said, "Guys, I can't do this." And he resigned his position. Very well paid. Excellent, excellent job. And now he doesn't have a job. And there were a couple of months where we got together and we prayed and we talked, not just myself, but several fellows were. And next thing we knew, he had found a position even better than the one he had had, making even more than what he had been making. And I absolutely believe God was honoring his honor. God was honoring his desire to do what was right and to stand up for what was right. A second point that I want us to notice here is that kindness really is a beautiful thing. I mean, I can't think of anything much more refreshing that makes you feel much better than to encounter kindness, can you? It's just such a beautiful, beautiful gift. What really sets Boaz apart in this story is not what he has. It's how he uses what he has. It is his kindness toward Ruth. Now, in reality, the kindness that Boaz shows to Ruth cost him next to nothing. It really does. I mean, most of the gleanings they're not going to pick up anyway. The edges of the field are going to be open to anybody who wants to gather. It's not going to cost him much. But in the process of him watching out for this little widow and making provision for her, you see God glorified, his will's honored. Here's a man who is honoring the law. God said, "This is how I want you to handle harvest." He doesn't ignore it. He honors that. Boaz, it's interesting. I think Boaz answers his own prayer. In verse 12, remember, the Lord, he's talking to Ruth, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. The Lord bless you because of what you're doing. And who will be the tool that will bless her? It's Boaz. In reality, in a sense, he's answering his prayer, isn't he? Or being used by God to answer that prayer. And of course, the lives of Ruth and Naomi are richly blessed because of this. I would have loved to have seen Naomi's expression that first night Ruth came home. When Ruth comes home with all this grain and leftovers that she's had from the meal that Boaz provided for her, because I'll guarantee you Naomi did not anticipate that at all. She is shocked and surprised in a very pleasant way by what she's encountered. And what Ruth has encountered, folks, is simply kindness. It's just kindness. Kindness, though it's like that, its return often far outweighs its cost. And one more thought about this. Did you notice what Boaz said in verse 11? Let me read that to you. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. Why is Boaz treating Ruth like he is? Because he's heard of the nobility of Ruth. He sees that here's this young foreigner who is taking care of her mother-in-law as well as herself and doing it in the most honorable way that she can. And he's seen that. He's noticing that. Makes me think of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Ruth is kind to Naomi, cares for Naomi, and now here's Boaz being kind to Ruth. And then one last thought from chapter 2 here, and that is, and this is beautiful, God really does take care of his own. In the New English Version, verse 3, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Listen to it. She happened to come to the part of the field. NIV translates a little differently. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz. Now, some would say, would they? Well, as luck would have it, she ended up in this field. Okay? I would argue that this has nothing whatsoever to do with luck. This is not about luck at all. Luck, if you think about it, is blind and clumsy and untrustworthy. Luck's chance, brothers and sisters. How many people have gone bankrupt trusting in luck? Trusting to chance. It's heartbreaking, the number that have. We're not talking about luck. We're not talking about chance. We're talking about the providence of God here. It's God's hand, I believe, that puts Ruth in that field at that time. When you go back in Scripture, you find this, the beauty of providence referred to again and again as people kind of look in the rearview mirror. Joseph in Genesis 50 verse 20, he's talking to his brothers. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. As we pointed out to you not that long ago when we were talking about how God works, not only does Joseph save his family, not only does he save the 70 who come down, it's way bigger than that. God uses Joseph to save the nation of Egypt. Think of the pickle they would be in if he had made provision to save all that grain all those years. Not only does he save the nation of Egypt, there are people clear up in Palestine who are starving. This drought, this famine extends way beyond the borders of Egypt. There are no telling how many millions of people God saved through Joseph. But Joseph had to go through all that he had to endure in order for that to happen. Joseph, looking back, sees God's hand working in his life and understands how all these events had to occur in order for him to be able to help people as he has. In Esther chapter 4 verse 14, a couple of weeks we'll look at Esther. But Mordecai will come to Esther and he'll ask her a question that I hope will ring for all of us in our thinking. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And it's true. I believe in our lives, brothers and sisters, there are times that you come to a time that God has brought you to. And He's got a reason why He's brought you to that moment. And it's so important that we be prepared to respond in those moments, as Esther will be prepared to respond in this incredibly important time in the history of Israel. Now, what's the difference between a miracle and providence? Because I hear people, and I think they kind of mix them up, and I believe it's two separate ways in which God's worked. And let me just use this analogy. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it kind of works for me. Miracles are the tornadoes of God's power. They rip the fabric of reality. They leave us in awe. The storm on the Sea of Galilee, the apostles scared to death they're going to drown. And the Master sits up and goes, "Hush, be still." And it is. And if you remember from the text, they're more afraid of Him than they are of what just happened. Okay? They're terrified at the power that He evinces. That is a miracle. Okay? Providence, I would liken to God's refreshing, gentle breeze. It's real, it's effective, it's ongoing, but it's subtle. But it's every bit as important in God working in our lives as those miracles were. And so the one who knows the end from the beginning, think about it, sees to it that Ruth just happens out of all the barley fields around Bethlehem at harvest time to choose to glean in the field of the one man who has both the way and the will to help her. Now again, that's not chance, that's not luck, that's providence. That's that soft, gentle breeze, God working in order to bring blessings about for those who are faithful to Him. Let me end with Psalm 95, verses 6 and 7. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. Brethren, light can shine in darkness. It can. It could 3,000 years ago, more than 3,000 years ago. It can today. Your light can shine in darkness. People can look at your life. They can see your faith shaping your life. And as Jesus says, remember in Matthew chapter 5, you're like a city set on a hill. Okay? Don't put your lamp under a bushel. Put it on a stand. Let it shine to all that are in the house. It's transformative. In a world that's stumbling around in the dark, how important it is, brothers and sisters, more than ever, that we provide the light that we can. And we see in Ruth the beauty of that light. This morning, if you're ready to come to the one who is light, ready to give your life to Him, ready to confess your faith in Jesus as a Son of God, to put on your Lord in baptism, if we can help you in your walk with the Lord in any way, won't you come? While we stand and while we sing.
Pierce my ear, O Lord, my God. Take me to your door this day. I will serve no other God. Lord, I'm here to stay, for you have paid the price for me. With your blood you ransomed me. I will serve you eternally. A free man I'll never be. So pierce my your door this day. I will serve no other God. Lord, I'm here.